I feel like it's some kind of crime to wear this chest rig in a video and not make some kind of reference to Operation Just Cause. Now, in today's video, we're looking at the practical differences between modern clones, parts kit builds, and original retro rifles. I'm really excited to jump into this, and you might be asking, who is this for? Well, if you know who this is for already, you might also be interested in the 8mm Mauser Man retro sticker. What's the best for you in your circumstance? Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is the modern clones. For that, I have this 601 clone that I bought at a gun show recently, and it's not a very good Brownell 601 clone because it's missing some things. It's sort of more like a 602, but without the chromed out bolt carrier group. So there are some advantages and some disadvantages to the modern clone. For the people who are collectors out there, these are not historical at all. Now, it's historical in that it looks historical and acts historical, but as somebody who's collecting historical things, this doesn't have that same value because it wasn't actually there and doing that. However, it does have some advantages as well, and that is that you can paint it, you can put a new barrel on it, you can change out the handguards, you can drill holes in the handguards, you can do whatever you want to this rifle. You're not ruining anything historical. You're not damaging anything. Now, another advantage of these is that they can be spot-on replicas of rifles that are virtually impossible to come by today. Colt 601s and 602s are incredibly rare. Colt 601 parts kits are incredibly expensive. So if you are interested in specifically a Colt 601 or a Colt 602, this might be your only practical way to actually get one. So if you are trying to be spot on with a replica and you don't necessarily care about the collectability or the historicity of the specific model you're buying, this can be a good option. And even right now, H&R, which is Palmetto State Armory and Nodak Spud and Harrington and Richardson all kind of coming together there, they're even making guns that have the exact same markings they had during the Vietnam War, which is really, really cool. It doesn't have that third pinhole though, so no felonies. But the other downside here is that these can usually be in excess of $1,000. So for us history nerds, you are paying more than $1,000 for something that doesn't hold a lot of history necessarily. But they are still really cool and they do have some uses. So if you're a user, if you are a shooter, and really in some ways if you're a cloner, this can be a great option for you. It can also just be a bit of a more pricey option. For the second option, we're going to talk about the parts kit builds. Now, this is my M16A1 parts kit build, and I know the handguards are wrong, the lower's wrong, the barrel's wrong. I'm actually fixing the front end of this with a purchase that I just made, so stand by and that'll be better in the future. The lower, I'm probably going to do one of those H&R ones. I built this during COVID, so I didn't have all the parts on hand at the time. These in price tend to be maybe a little bit more than the modern clones if you're trying to get all the right parts, but really they're significantly cheaper than the original Colts. If you're talking about an original machine gun Colt, this is significantly cheaper. Because of that less expense, it can be more difficult to find the exact right parts. Like, finding the exact right barrel is hard. You might need to go the parts kit build, but with a modern cloned barrel route. Recently, I found out that you can get FN barrels that were actual military contract barrels on Gunbroker, and they're not super expensive. So that was what I ended up buying, and that's what I'm really excited to put on this when it eventually arrives. Now, the other thing to mention here is that I think these can hold value more than the modern clones. The modern clones are just modern guns, but these, for the collector, hold a little more value as an actual piece of history. This way, without spending machine gun money, you can have an actual military gun. Now, the final thing to note about these guns is that sometimes they can be badly worn. And that badly worn thing can be an advantage and a disadvantage. So disadvantage number one, they tend to be less valuable to collectors because collectors want things in pristine condition. So the collectors are a little less interested in it, but for me, who's a shooter and doesn't really care much about that, I just like the historicity of these things, I'm not super concerned about that. So it means we can get it a little cheaper. The other disadvantage of the dings and that kind of thing is that parts can be not serviceable anymore. The old handguards I had on this could still be used, but they were very damaged. They had a lot of cracks that had been repaired. There were several missing teeth on the A1s. So this, I think, is a good route For the cloner, if they're looking for something that's, relatively stock, the hard thing is you would be ruining a historical piece if you, like, let's say you wanted to clone one of those rifles that had the Weaver rail right here, and you wanted to chop the handguard up. You would be ruining a historical part. It also is more of a expensive part if you're going to ruin it in that way. For the shooter, I think it's great. It does the exact same thing as the other options, but it does carry a little more historicity. And for the users, it works fine too, as long as the parts that you have are in an okay condition. Personally, this is what I think is the coolest route to go. I really like this rifle a lot, and I'm excited to get the upper half repaired, and then I'm excited to get that lower end too once I get around to that. All right, finally, we're going to talk about originals. First thing we got to talk about is the original Colts. The Colts can be expensive. They are probably the most expensive option. If you're looking at machine guns, they are very, very, very expensive. But even if you're talking about civilian SP1s and that kind of thing, I think those are pretty overpriced. You're looking at maybe $2,000 and up for some of those original Colts. And personally, as somebody who likes history, as somebody who wanted an M16A1 because of interest in the Vietnam War, those are less interesting to me because some guy owned it. It wasn't property of the US military or another military or something like that. So they're just less interesting to me as a collector. But for the value, these would retain their value pretty good. This is possibly the best quality for the original guns. When you're looking at something like this, they are a little cheaper, but those are really high quality, especially those older Colts. Then the other thing we need to talk about with the originals, like this Rock River Arms, we need to talk about the civilian and police brands. We're talking about things like Rock River Arms, Bushmasters, Olympic Arms, and there are a ton of others, Armalite, stuff like that. So these can tend to be cheaper than the Colts, and they definitely have a different history. This one's not a military gun, but if you look right here, you're going to see a marking that says restricted for law enforcement and government use only. This, as a restricted law enforcement gun and as a police gun, still has an interesting history. For example, you can see that there's a lot of wear on the handguard right here, probably from where it was clamped inside of a patrol car. I just think that is a really cool part of this history. And also, if you talk about the Olympic arms and those kinds of things, they can be really cheap. There was a Bushmaster at a local gun store that had a C7 upper on it for like $400. Those types of things can be very, very affordable, and a very affordable way to get into retro rifles. And if you buy one of those old Bushmasters, most of the parts are really good. They just have an old, really heavy barrel in them. And if they're from the band period, then the barrel doesn't have an opportunity for a muzzle device or those kinds of things. But you change out that barrel and you have a really cool replica of a Colt gun, or you can also just have a really cool usable gun. And the other thing to note is that these are sometimes, like I said, lower quality. For example, Olympic Arms was kind of the Anderson of the day, if you know modern AR brands. They just didn't make the best stuff, but it is good enough. If you just want to go out and shoot and you don't necessarily care about having the best rifle, it's perfectly fine as a range toy. Especially also, if you're just going to use the upper in another build and some of the lower parts, change out the bolt carrier group, change out the barrel, and you can have a really decent rifle that started with Olympic, and then you can, use some of those parts for other things or what have you. So I think that the civilian and police type thing is interesting to the collector in other ways. Like I said, the police guns are interesting. It's interesting to the cloner because you can get some stuff that's really, really cheap and then turn it into whatever you want. It's interesting to the shooter because it does the exact same thing as any other gun. But it's interesting to the user because, this is a pretty quality rifle that really wasn't that expensive. And if you want to see a video on the advantages of a fixed carry handle gun over a flat top upper, let me know. I'd be really interested in doing a video on that, and I'd be really interested in exploring some different options. All of that being said, I am 8mm Mauser Man, and I'm kind of surrounded by guns right now. But I lived on.
Which proves